The wind howled through the train station, sending the light flurries of snow tumbling like whispers across the platform. It was winter of 1887 in Dust Creek, Wyoming territory, a small, isolated town where the cold bit deeper than most could understand. As the last train of the day steamed away, the young woman stood frozen, her eyes locked on the fading smoke trail. The clinking of metal and the shrill whistle of the train were slowly replaced by the oppressive silence of an empty station. Her heart, too, seemed to freeze in the cold, heavy air. She was barely 20, but life had already taken so much from her. The baby wrapped in her arms was the only thing she had left to hold on to. The man who had promised her a new life in Wyoming had abandoned her without a second glance. The baby whimpered softly, its tiny face swaddled in the worn remnants of a blanket. The young woman's coat, frayed and thin, did little to protect her from the bitter chill. She shivered, not from the cold, but from the weight of her new, harsh reality. The ticket clerk's voice broke through the stillness, calling out to her through the wind. "Ma'am, I need your name for the station record," he asked, his tone growing impatient. She raised her eyes slowly, her hands trembling from more than just the cold. "I don't have one anymore," she whispered, the words barely escaping her lips. She felt as though her past had been ripped away from her, leaving her here alone and nameless. She had been someone once, Evelyn Hart, daughter of the Reverend Nathaniel Hart, the respected preacher of their town. But now, Evelyn Hart was nothing more than a memory, a name forgotten like the wind that swept through the desolate platform. Her journey to Wyoming had begun with hope, the hope of starting fresh, leaving behind the brokenness of her past. But the cold reality of the West had a way of extinguishing hope, just like the last train pulling away into the distance. Now, she was just a young woman standing at a train station with a baby and no name to speak of. No family, no future, just the bitter winds and the snow. She was invisible to the world around her, her presence unnoticed by those passing through the station. Little did she know, however, that her journey was far from over. And standing just beyond the shadows, a man watched her, a silent cowboy who would offer her not just a name, but a new chance at life. A chance to start again, no longer lost, but found. The heartbreaking backstory: Evelyn Hart, once a beacon of grace and respect in her small town, had everything laid out for her. She was the daughter of the Reverend Nathaniel Hart, the man whose sermons moved hearts and whose words commanded respect. Every Sunday, Evelyn sat in the front pew, her white gloves neatly folded in her lap, her voice ringing softly in the hymns that filled the air. She was the epitome of what every good Christian woman was supposed to be: gracious, composed, and destined for a good marriage to someone of equal respect and standing. Her life was set, or so she thought. Then, the merchant came into town. He was young, well-spoken, and wore clothes that gleamed with the wealth of the East. He spoke of cities Evelyn had never seen, of opportunities beyond her small town that beckoned like promises of a different life. And when he spoke to her, he made her feel seen, important, like she was the only woman in the world. His smile was warm and inviting, his words wrapped in sweetness. By the time Evelyn realized she was carrying his child, it was too late. The merchant, who had promised her a life of love and adventure, vanished like smoke, leaving only the burning truth behind. When her father found out, it was as if the world had collapsed in on her. With the fury of a man scorned, he cast her out, declaring her unworthy of her name. "You've shamed this house," he had shouted, his voice trembling with righteous anger. "You are no longer my daughter." Her mother, standing silently behind him, had offered no comfort, no sympathy. Not a single tear was shed for the life Evelyn was about to lose. With nothing but a few coins, a blanket, and a broken heart, Evelyn left that night, walking down the dirt road away from the only life she had ever known. She would never be Evelyn Hart again. She would never be the respected daughter of the preacher. Instead, she would be just a woman with a child, abandoned, lost, and nameless. She set her sights on Wyoming, chasing promises of a fresh start, a place where no one would know her past. But Wyoming, like the rest of the world, had its own harsh realities. The journey had been longer than she expected, the promises broken just as quickly as they were made. And now, standing on the platform with nothing but a baby in her arms, Evelyn realized the truth. She was alone, with nothing to call her own. No name, no family, just the remnants of a broken dream. At the train station, a new beginning. The night was cold and still as Evelyn stood at the deserted train station, the last train having long since disappeared into the horizon. She could feel the chill of the air biting at her skin, but it wasn't the cold that made her shiver. It was the overwhelming sense of emptiness that seemed to settle over her like the snow that covered the earth. Her hands, trembling from more than just the cold, held the baby tightly to her chest. She had no name to give, no identity to speak of, and no one to turn to. The ticket clerk, now growing impatient, asked again, "Ma'am, I need your name." His words seemed to echo in the cold, empty space between them. But Evelyn didn't have an answer. Her name was gone, her identity lost to the winds of shame. The snow caught in her lashes, melting and running down her cheeks like silent tears. "I don't have one," she murmured softly, more to herself than to the clerk. There was no pride in her voice, only a sense of utter defeat. The world had already forgotten her, and now she had forgotten herself. The future that had once seemed so full of promise now felt like an endless void, an abyss she couldn't escape. Evelyn sat down on the cold bench, her eyes focused on the ground. The wind whipped through the station, carrying the scent of iron and frost. But Evelyn didn't move. She couldn't. She didn't know where to go or what to do. She had left everything behind, including the hope of ever finding her place in this world. The baby, still wrapped in the blanket, whimpered softly. Evelyn rocked him gently, her voice a faint whisper. "Hush, sweet one, Mama's here." Her words broke on the wind, but they were all she had left to give. She looked up for a moment, meeting the eyes of a passerby. The woman pulled her child closer, casting a quick glance at Evelyn before turning away. She wasn't the only one to avoid her. Everyone did. And just as the weight of it all threatened to swallow her, the shadow of a man fell across her. Evelyn looked up, startled. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, his face hidden beneath the brim of his hat. But his presence, his stillness, was unmistakable. He stood there without speaking, his gaze steady, his expression unreadable. Evelyn didn't know what to say. She didn't know how to explain the weight of her situation. But before she could speak, the man silently removed his scarf and draped it over her shoulders. The warmth of it was a shock, a simple gesture that meant more than words ever could. She looked up at him, her lips trembling, but he said nothing. His silence, oddly, was the most comforting thing she had felt in a long time. You don't have to do this," she whispered, but he didn't respond. Instead, he just stood there, watching her, his eyes soft yet firm. And in that silence, Evelyn realized that for the first time in months, she wasn't alone. The world hadn't forgotten her entirely. The silent cowboy appears. The cold was unbearable, yet Evelyn felt a strange warmth settling over her as the man stood before her, watching her with quiet, steady eyes. The wind continued to howl, but his presence seemed to calm the storm within her, even if just for a moment. She looked up at him, searching his face for some sign of judgment, but all she saw was something she hadn't expected: understanding. He wasn't here to question her or make her explain the mess that had led her to this point. Richard Avery was a man of few words, but there was something powerful in the way he stood, tall and unwavering against the storm, his hat pulled low over his eyes. His silence wasn't just absence, there was weight to it, a kind of depth that Evelyn felt instinctively. This man had seen pain, too. He knew what it was like to be broken. When he moved toward her, Evelyn flinched, instinctively pulling the baby closer to her chest as if to shield him from whatever harm might come next. But instead of harsh words or an intrusive question, Richard did something unexpected. He removed his scarf, one of those thick woolen ones that could keep a man warm even in the harshest of winters, and draped it gently over her shoulders. Evelyn blinked, startled. It was a simple gesture, but it hit her harder than anything else that had happened that day. For the first time, someone, anyone, was offering her something without asking for anything in return. She swallowed hard, her throat tight, but she couldn't form the words to thank him. Instead, she simply met his eyes, her expression softening as she let the warmth of the scarf settle around her. I have no name," she whispered, the weight of her situation crashing down on her again. "He left us." Richard didn't flinch. His eyes never wavered as he looked down at her, then at the baby. Evelyn felt a flicker of uncertainty rise in her chest, but it was quickly subdued by the silent strength of the man before her. And then, in a voice rough but steady, he spoke the words she had never expected to hear. "You do now." It wasn't a question or an offer. It was a statement, simple but profound, like a promise that something would change, that this nameless existence she had been living would no longer define her. His words echoed in her mind as she slowly extended her hand to him. Her fingers trembled, unsure of what to do, unsure of where this silent cowboy would lead her. But as soon as her hand touched his, it felt like the weight of her past had lightened. The cold, the namelessness, the shame, it all seemed to drift away. For the first time in what felt like forever, Evelyn wasn't alone. She didn't have to carry this burden by herself anymore. And as Richard led her away from the train station, she realized that maybe, just maybe, she had found the beginning of something new. The moment of connection. A name is given. Evelyn walked behind Richard, her hand still in his, the baby cradled in her arms. The snow continued to fall around them, thickening the world into a blanket of white. Each step they took seemed to echo in the stillness, and for the first time, the silence between them felt comfortable, not oppressive. Evelyn wasn't sure what to say. She didn't need to explain herself to this man. He had already given her more than anyone else ever had. As they walked, the town of Dust Creek came into view, a few scattered buildings nestled between rolling hills. It was quiet here, the world feeling smaller, more contained, like a place where people could hide from everything that might hurt them. And that was exactly what Evelyn needed. She wasn't ready to face the world. She wasn't ready to return to her past. She just needed a place to breathe, to be. They reached a small cabin on the outskirts of town, a simple structure made of weathered wood, with smoke curling up from the chimney. It wasn't much, but it was shelter, a place where Evelyn could finally rest, a place where she could gather the pieces of herself she had lost. Richard opened the door, leading her inside. The warmth of the fire hit her immediately, the heat from the stove wrapping around her like an embrace. The baby stirred in her arms, his cries soft but insistent, and Evelyn quickly settled him into a small cot by the fire. As she looked around the room, she realized that it wasn't just a shelter. It was a home, a safe place. Richard didn't need to say anything. He didn't need to offer her any promises. His actions spoke louder than any words could. Evelyn took a deep breath, the weight of the past few days settling on her shoulders. She was exhausted, physically and emotionally. But she was here now, and for the first time in a long while, she felt the stirrings of something she hadn't felt in ages: hope. For the first time since she had arrived in Wyoming, she wasn't thinking about her past. She wasn't worrying about the name she had left behind, the life she had lost. All she had to think about now was the present and the strange, silent cowboy who had taken her in without question. But as she sat by the fire, the quiet of the cabin stretching out around them, she realized something important. Richard had not only given her a name, but he had given her something even more valuable. He had given her the freedom to be who she was, to start over, and to build a life from the ground up. No judgments, no shame, just the promise of a future. The silent cowboy's shelter, a new home. The fire crackled softly in the corner of the room, its warmth filling the small space as Evelyn sat in silence, cradling her baby. The man, Richard Avery, had been quiet ever since they entered the cabin, his eyes never leaving the flickering flames. His presence was a strange comfort, the kind of solace she had never known before. It wasn't just the fire that warmed her. It was the quiet steadiness that Richard seemed to exude, a calm that wrapped around her like a protective shield. Evelyn had been so used to fighting, to surviving on her own, that she hadn't known what to do with the peace that had settled over her. She had expected to be turned away, judged, or worse, ignored. Yet Richard had given her none of that. He had simply taken her in, no questions asked, no expectations. And, in doing so, he had given her the one thing she had lost, a sense of belonging. As she sat by the fire, she couldn't help but watch Richard from the corner of her eye. He was tending to the baby, gently rocking him in his arms, his expression unreadable, yet somehow soft. It struck Evelyn how different he was from the men she had known. He wasn't quick to anger or full of the bravado that often masked weakness. There was an unspoken kindness in his actions, a quiet strength that made her feel safe, something she hadn't felt in a long time. The baby settled in Richard's arms, his tiny breaths even and peaceful, and Evelyn sighed softly, her gaze lingering on them both. She felt the weight of her worries start to lift, if only a little. There was something about this place, this shelter, that made her believe she could begin again. Maybe, just maybe, she could put the pieces of her life back together. Richard didn't speak much, but his actions were clear. He didn't question her, didn't pry into her past. He simply offered her shelter, food, and the warmth of his presence. Evelyn couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of gratitude toward him, something deep and unspoken. For the first time since she had left her father's house, she felt like she had found a place where she could just be herself. The unspoken bond, Richard's silence. The days turned into weeks, and Evelyn began to settle into life with Richard. The cabin, though small and rough, became their refuge. The howling winds outside, the biting cold, and the endless expanse of snow seemed a distant memory as she spent her days by the fire, caring for the baby, and slowly finding herself again. Richard, in his quiet, steady way, made no demands, asked no questions. He simply moved through his day with a calm that was both reassuring and mysterious. As the days passed, Evelyn began to see the depths of Richard's silence. He wasn't a man of words, and at first, that had made her uneasy. In her world, words were currency. They were the way you explained yourself, made yourself understood. But Richard didn't need words. His silence was not empty. It was full of purpose. It was a silence born of strength and understanding. In his quiet, Evelyn found a rare kind of peace. She began to notice the small things he did for her. The way he would check the fire without a word, making sure it was always burning bright enough to keep them warm. The way he fed the horses and chopped wood, his strong hands moving with efficiency, never a complaint escaping his lips. Richard's silence wasn't about withdrawing. It was about being present, about offering something greater than words could ever convey. Evelyn found herself learning to speak a different language, a language of actions, of subtle gestures, of shared understanding. Richard's patience and kindness spoke louder than any words could. When the baby cried, Richard was always the first to rise, his hands gentle as he soothed him to sleep. He never seemed rushed, never seemed to mind the tasks that needed doing. And through all of this, Evelyn began to understand him better, understand that this man, though quiet, was perhaps the most honest man she had ever known. The silent gift, a handmade cradle. It was a cold morning when Richard returned from the barn, carrying something in his arms. Evelyn had just finished feeding the baby, her hands still warm from the task, when Richard stepped into the cabin. He moved silently, as always, but there was a softness to his demeanor that caught her attention. In his arms was something she hadn't expected. He set the wooden object down before her, a rough-hewn cradle. The edges were uneven, the wood still rough from where it had been carved, but there was a certain beauty to it. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat as she reached out to touch it. She could feel the craftsmanship in the grain of the wood, the care Richard had put into creating it. Without a word, Richard stood back, his eyes never leaving her as she ran her fingers along the cradle. It was a simple thing, but in that moment, it felt like the most precious gift she had ever received. He had given her something to hold her child in, a place where the baby could rest, a symbol of stability and care. The weight of it hit her all at once. Richard had not just provided for them with food or shelter, he had provided something more. He had given them a future, a sense of belonging in a world that had left them behind. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she quickly wiped them away. She didn't need to say anything. Richard's silent gesture had already spoken for him. She looked up at him, her voice barely a whisper as she spoke. "Thank you," he nodded, a simple, silent acknowledgement, before turning to leave the cabin. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with understanding. In that moment, Evelyn knew that she wasn't alone anymore. She had found not just a place to stay, but a home. And it wasn't just built on the things they had, it was built on trust, on kindness, and on the silent strength of the man who had never once asked her to explain herself. The test, the baby's illness. It was one of those nights when the wind howled louder than usual, the storm outside relentless in its fury. Evelyn had just finished tending to the baby, rocking him gently by the fire, when she noticed something wasn't right. His tiny body felt warmer than usual, too warm. His little face flushed with fever, his tiny hands limp by his side. Panic surged in Evelyn's chest. She had no medicine, no way to help him. She had no idea what to do. The baby whimpered softly, his breaths shallow and quick. Evelyn held him close, tears welling in her eyes as she rocked him back and forth, trying desperately to calm him. Richard was across the room, tending to the fire, but when he saw the panic in Evelyn's eyes, he was immediately at her side. Without a word, he took the baby from her arms, his movements gentle but purposeful. There was no hesitation, no confusion. Richard simply knew what needed to be done. He wrapped the baby in his coat, lifted him gently into his arms, and turned to Evelyn. "We're going to the doctor," he said, his voice low and firm. Evelyn didn't question him. She had never seen him this determined before, and it gave her the strength to follow him. They stepped out into the storm, the wind howling around them, the snow falling so thickly that they could barely see a few feet in front of them. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest as she followed Richard through the snow, her boots sinking into the drifts, the cold biting at her skin. But Richard moved forward with a steady pace, the baby cradled securely in his arms. She followed, not questioning, just trusting. When they finally reached the doctor's cabin, Richard knocked twice before pushing the door open. The doctor, an older man with graying hair, took one look at the baby and sprang into action. "It's just a fever," the doctor said after a quick examination, "but it's a rough one. Keep him warm, keep him hydrated, and he'll be fine." Relief flooded through Evelyn's chest. She looked at Richard, who was standing by the door, his face unreadable, but his eyes soft. He had braved the storm, had carried her child through the worst of it, without a word, without hesitation. She realized then, in that quiet moment, that Richard Avery had given her more than just shelter or protection. He had given her something even more precious, a future, a family, and that was more than she could have ever hoped for. The final choice, a family forged in silence. Months passed, and Evelyn, now going by Jane, began to build a life with Richard. Their days were simple, but full of meaning. They tended to the land, cared for the animals, and, most importantly, they had created a home for themselves and the baby. They were a family, though they didn't speak the words. In their silence, in their actions, they had built something more enduring than any promise. One day, a man from Jane's past arrived. Charles Linton, a man she had once known, came to claim the baby. He told Jane that the child belonged to his family, that he deserved more than the life she could offer him. His words were sharp, cutting through the quiet like a knife. But Richard didn't flinch. He didn't say a word. He simply stood by Jane, his presence a silent declaration that this was their family, and no one would take it away from them. In that moment, Jane realized something profound. It wasn't the name that mattered, it was the love, the silent understanding that had been forged between them. She didn't need to be defined by her past anymore. She had found a place, a purpose, and a family, one that had been chosen, not born into. And as she stood there, hand in hand with Richard, she knew she had found her place in this world, not as the woman she had been, but as the woman she had become.